2G full drive shaft with an extended nose piece on the tube. It's not easier to have, like, if it's cheap enough, you can have it rebuilt, you can have it ready to go, and then just swap it.
Carry the rest. Stay here. Yeah, I'm your assistant.
Awkwardly?
Yes, you stand awkwardly.
We're just gonna start whenever.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone, Morrison Fabrication, there's a booth over here. You can find out more. But if you don't know already, they make some pretty, as Robert was saying, they make some pretty badass turbo headers, or turbo manifolds, whatever you want to call it. So, with no further ado, take it over.
I just want to start out that public speaking isn't exactly a language that I'm fluent in. So,
Got this,
for the first part, for the intro, if you don't mind me stumbling through it, I'm going to just read it so I can just get it out. The rest, I'm going to try to just riff on, and that'll be a lot more comfortable for me, hopefully a lot more comfortable for everyone else. So, I'm Matt. This is my wife, Samantha, of Morrison Fabrications. We specialize in turbo manifolds and hot parts for DSMs, Evos. We've been doing this as a business for a few years now. Most of our background comes from modifying, experimenting, racing our own projects. Samantha got started with her 1G in the early 2000s. I came along a little bit later in the mid 2000s. Most of our knowledge is from hands-on experience and digging into the forums, which is just how it was back then. Even with a little decent background and having made my own turbo manifold early on, it was surprisingly successful. We spent nearly the first year as a business not offering any product, but just nailing down the fabrication and welding process. Ron at Shootout Fabrications was pivotal in getting us up to speed quickly, and the whole reason for us deciding to do the start of the business in the first place. He was moving on from the DSM and Evo side of things and contacted Samantha about taking it over, along with passing on many years of trial, error, testing, documentations, and jigs for the parts themselves. I want to talk about what a turbo manifold actually does and how our viewpoint has changed over the years. It won't be just about turbo manifolds, since you really need to look at the entire system to actually make sense of what's going on in it. I'm going to try to just riff now. And I have this here to keep me on track so I don't go too far off, kind of cover what I want to.
So, do you mind if I take this around?
Yeah, I can pass them out along.
All right, so we're going to pass around the manifold so you guys can take a look.
So I guess I don't want to kind of lay out what I'm talking about. I'm going to focus on pretty much the quality and density and pressure of the air in the intake manifold itself. Talk about the engine itself as far as like cylinder head airflow, and a little bit about camshafts, but that's kind of tricky because that's really complicated. I'm still getting the hang of it. Of course, the turbo manifold itself, which is the series of tubes that go from the exhaust port to the turbine housing itself, different configurations, lengths, etc. And also, of course, the turbo itself, which is integral, obviously, which is the turbine wheel that the exhaust manifold goes into. That's directly connected with a shaft to the compressor wheel, so everything's spinning at the same rate, directly tied together. Everything kind of before it and after it, we're just going to assume flows well. They can make a big difference, but pretty much the less restriction you have, the better. So kind of keep it easy there. So I'm going to start by talking about the first back-to-back test that we did, where all we changed was the manifold itself. Did it on the dyno, some little things, but everything else is pretty much the same. It was on Samantha's car, her DSM. So this is before the business, we had the consolidated runner divided T4, which some people may know about. It's essentially like a 4-to-2-to-1 or a tri-Y header, which is really common on like NA applications. And they tend to produce more torque and kind of move things down more in the RPM range. And we wanted to see if we could apply that to a turbo application and maybe get it to spool up a little bit sooner, maybe move the curve around a little bit more. And we compared that against a standard top mount, again divided T4, but all the runners merge the collector. Instead of merging on ours, they would merge early, paired correctly, of course, so the center two runners merge, outside runners merged, and then they both travel a little ways and then back up into the turbine housing, which is what happens anyway in a divided setup. We just did it sooner. So that cuts down on the internal volume of the manifold itself, which allows it to what we were hoping, and in theory allows it to send a little bit more energy to the turbine itself, cut down on the internal volume, and then just less, I'll just take the rest of it.
What do you do with the diameters on that?
They were the same.
You gotta,
They were the same. Yep.
okay.
So yeah, that's a good point too. So the runner size itself didn't change. So we merged them, but it merged in the same size pipe. And what we wanted to test, we knew in theory that when it's a divided setup, you have pulses and you line them up, so it's pretty much one pulse going through at a time. So if you think about it, how we wanted to think about it is you don't have two pulses trying to take up the same space, so you can keep the runner the same size, even though there's just one runner controlling two cylinders. So we did the dyno test because people were interested in it. We thought about it beforehand, but people were interested in it, so we wanted to make sure before we offered it. So we did the dyno test, and it did show up as quicker spool. It spooled quicker, which allowed it to make in the mid-range 90 wheel horsepower more, which sounds like a lot, but a lot of that is from just the quicker spool. So it's, a little bit of that too was making more torque at the same boost, which is really cool. And then I would just want to mention too, like I said, the 90 wheel horsepower sounded like a lot, but it was a mid 800 wheel horsepower setup to begin with, so it wasn't huge.
10% difference is real.
But it's still good. But it's mostly from just spooling sooner, so you could say that a smaller AR housing makes a bunch more power, but it's just getting boosted, which everyone knows more boost, more power. And then the standard top mount still made 14 wheel horsepower more up top, which was kind of expected. And we don't think it was anything as far as like the consolidated becoming a restriction, because drive pressures, which is the amount of pressure it took on the exhaust side to make the boost, was within like 1 or 2 PSI, so it was really close, which is what we wanted to prove, that it wasn't a restriction to go with that design. And I guess what I was trying to get to is that 14 wheel horsepower on the standard top mount, the lengths are long enough where there is actually a wave tuning effect, and it was super high up there at 9,500 RPM. And that's more so probably what picked up the horsepower there, rather than the consolidated tri-Y being a restriction, if that makes sense. And then also, volumetric efficiency. I'm not sure how familiar people are with it. My main relationship with it was just like on DSM, like when you set up the VE map for speed density and everything. We had to add fuel on the tri-Y one, or the consolidated, by about 5% down low, whereas the standard top mount, which we were testing against, is right at 5% up top. So it kind of shifted things a little bit. Just meant that one was more efficient down low, one was more efficient up top. Again, the main thing was showing it wasn't a restriction by the drive pressure. The drive pressure is like super low. So it was a larger turbo setup. It was a 42R, 76 millimeter. It wasn't being pushed at all, and we could tell that by the drive pressure itself, which was always below 1 to 1. So we always had more boost than we had exhaust pressure throughout the entire run. It was really favorable. What happens if you have more boost than exhaust pressure? You have an overlap phase where both valves are open. And if you have more boost than exhaust pressure, when they're both open, that dictates which direction that flow is going to go. Is it going to fill the cylinder with intake pressure charge, good air to burn later, or is it going to fill it with residual exhaust gas? Which is like a big reason why larger turbos make more power. Let's see here quick. Yeah, before becoming not limited, because you have the extra exhaust gas in there. If you have much less drive pressure at the same boost, you can just get away with a lot more. And something I want to bring up too, as far as equal length, on the top mount, it's long enough where you can get up to the RPM where you can catch the wave in time to take advantage of it. On most setups, pretty much all setups besides a DSM top mount, it's too short where you could never rev it high enough, especially because it's typically a smaller turbo anyway and it doesn't need to be revved that high. Never rev it high enough to actually take advantage of a beneficial tuning effect anyway. So if you have it a certain length, you really don't have to worry that much wave tuning wise about like equal length isn't important at that point. It's not a critical length where you're going to get anything anyway, which I think is important to say. Honestly, a lot of times you try to keep it under that length so you don't have to worry about like air and tuning effects and mess with distribution and all that stuff. So the second test is about we had the FP race manifold on a stock replacement Evo 8, and then we had our tubular manifold for it. Some of the design factors is the FP actually had about 20% larger diameter runners, had less internal volume, and it had more direct routing since it was a cast manifold, but it had a little less guidance at the collector itself since it needs to stay so flat. So it doesn't aim, for example, for ours, it really goes in, kind of like that too.
Yeah, that's.
Where it really aims it right into the turbine housing.
Did you guys see that already?
So there are a lot of things going back and forth. The lower volume, like we showed in the previous test, can slow spool just because it has a little bit larger to expand into and maybe not get quite as much to the turbine to drive it. Yeah, and we had the smaller runners because we wanted to not only make more power up top, but he also wanted to, especially to match the bolt-on options, retain that spool in mid-range. If you ever want to lose your appetite for a day, just wait for test results from a state away doing testing on your manifold. But luckily, after it got swapped on and they saw that it leaned way out. It was a speed density car. Again, with VE, you have to, if you have airflow, more airflow somewhere, and it just is relying on a map sensor at a certain boost level, it doesn't know how much airflow is coming in at that boost. So if you lean the car, if the car leans out after doing a change, it's usually a really good thing. We would have to add more fuel to match that extra airflow, which is great. So we saw it leaned out a bunch and it picked up a bunch of power at the same boost, which is fantastic. We had our appetite back again. And I do want to, I don't know where I'm going to get into it now. So volumetric efficiency, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. If it's like an NA car, you can have like, let's say 100% volumetric efficiency to work with. With a turbo car, you can look at it where you can have like 200, 300, 400% volumetric efficiency. Every time I'm going to talk about volumetric efficiency, it's about the quality, pressure, density, and temperature of the air in the intake manifold itself. And then that versus what makes its way into the cylinder. So let's say you have 90% VE, it means you got 90% of that potential air from the intake manifold into the cylinder itself, filling it. So volumetric efficiency is how well the cylinder fills. Let's see. And I guess, I mean, if no change, if we didn't have to change, if they didn't have to change the AFR at all, and simply now, like, you can really tell if something is working by having to do a fuel change to go along with it, as long as there's like no leaks in the fuel system.
I think you're making a great point right there. And that is like always the first question that always comes up. You change the parts, like, did it need more fuel?
Exactly.
You know, and so like so I'm glad you hit on that, because that's a question a lot of people think of a lot of times. They put a part in the car, they go, well, I don't know, what did it do? What did it do? You know, well, at the seat of the pants, you change the oil, you feel like it worked and make the car work better. But really, the test is like you just pointed out. Did it need more fuel?
And it's almost like backwards too, where you could see just street tuning. Oh, it needed more fuel here, so you kind of know if you took it to the dyno, you're probably going to be making more power, because like airflow in this case is a complete system, is like everything.
And another thing there is, if you buy a part and they say, well, you need to increase the boost for that to work, if you bought yourself a bad part. We did an intake manifold shootout once, way back in the days. Dave helped us on it, and one of the manufacturers, well, you got to crank up the boost with my manifold. All right, okay. So
That's how I overcome your problems. That's how I defeat your manifold.
If you have to increase the boost pressure for the part to work, you have a problem. Yes.
And like honestly, we're really proud to be able to say, like, I know you're just changing an exhaust manifold and it's just a stock replacement or whatever manifold. Like, keep an eye on the tune, because when it actually does work, it's going to lean out a bit. Don't just blindly go into it, changing that, and not actually looking at the air fuel to get it back in line. So that's like a point of pride, I guess. As far as the actual results themselves from the test, in the same boost, actually lower boost, which I might get into a little bit, it gained about between the when it was under boost itself, between 20 and 30 wheel horsepower, about 12 to 24 peak torque under full boost. Pretty much below 5,000 RPM, and kind of during spool there wasn't like an appreciable difference. Ours did that despite being mostly lower boost. It was an electronic boost control setup. It didn't have like a feedback setup, so it wouldn't get the boost back up there, and also that boost control duty cycle. I'm honestly not that well versed in electronic boost control stuff, but it wasn't exact boost. But from everything that we could look at where it was even where it was lower boost, it still made more power. We attributed that to mostly lower drive and back pressure, even though there was unfortunately no drive pressure data taken. So we had the third test, which was Nathan Chrisman on the DSM stock replacement. Again, not picking on FP, but that's just the standard. It's the benchmark. It was ours, which is floating around against the FP raceman. It kind of had the same design factors as the Evo test. Again, ours a little bit smaller runner, a little bit better angle of entry, and kind of guided to the collector where it needed to go. And the volume difference was kind of working against ours for spool up. A little less direct path, even though it's a more directed path. And yeah, it was actually really tough to make it, and we weren't going to make it, but we did, and we tested it, and we were happy. The spool was actually quicker with our manifold, and it wasn't really from just. If you looked at the boost curve itself, the boost didn't necessarily come on sooner, but it made a bunch more power at the same boost. So even though the boost curve is kind of like ramping up similar-ish, the power curve was ramping up quite a bit sooner, which meant it was making more power in the same boost, which is pretty awesome, to be honest. Especially around 6,000 RPM, where it had 60 wheel horsepower gains at that same boost in RPM. And again, we had boost variance. We later found that they had a wastegate position sensor that was starting. We did our manifold last, and then during like the higher boost runs, it started to bleed off. And we're assuming it was from the loosening wastegate position sensor, which eventually fell off, allowing boost to bleed off. So again, kind of another factor. But either way, ours made more power despite that until about 8,000 RPM, and then the FP manifold made the most power of the day on its 44 PSI run, and then ours was 15 wheel horsepower shy on its prior 40 PSI run. Drive pressures this time were logged. Here we go, yeah. So drive pressures were logged, and we were kind of surprised to see that our manifold had a little bit higher drive pressure. So it had higher drive pressure, but yet it was making a much more power at the same boost, which kind of threw us for a loop.
You got better collecting.
But again, despite that, the VE was still up. It's actually like almost everywhere is about 10% VE, because Haltech was doing it in real time. Adjusting the fueling, you can go back in and see that it's about 10% more VE, which says 10% more airflow pretty much across it. And then again, that peak about 12%, which again, 12% lined up again with the 60 wheel horsepower. So everything matched up, which was great. But we kind of wondered, like, how is our manifold supplying that much of a VE change? How is it changing the amount of air that is available in the intake manifold getting into the cylinder? Because during overlap, you only have a small window of that overlap where the exhaust side can kind of like reach through and have an effect on the intake. Otherwise, they're separated by different strokes. So we thought that it probably has something to do with the camshafts and how much overlap is available. So stock camshafts, very little overlap, and then more aggressive, you get more and more overlap.
Those last two sentences, you can say them 100 more times. Okay, because that's such a big point. You're talking about just the opportunity of the high exhaust pressure to reach through that exhaust port and mess with that intake port. It's a real thing. It sounds like words if you're not visualizing it, but that's a big impact. That's a big impact.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the main benefits of your manifold is that
during overlap, which way is it going to go?
Yeah.
So Kevin Jeweler, we were kind of confused. We reached out to Kevin Jewer. He was nice enough to help analyze the data. He delved into the the Haltech data logs, and he manually extrapolated the airflow through multiple approaches to double check the results. To like everyone involved surprise, our manifold consistently showed more airflow almost everywhere and peaked the airflow sooner over a broader RPM range. But then another thing, he drilled it into us that once that compressor airflow is peaked and maxed out, that's the ultimate limit for how much power or airflow the setup can make. And there's not much else it can use. You can change the exhaust manifold, you can pretty much do whatever, but once it's at that peak airflow, that's it. That's all the airflow you're gonna get. And also that airflow is the biggest deciding factor of how much power this setup is capable of. That's how much fuel you can burn with that amount of air. And we're fine with that. I mean, ours tended to max the turbo out sooner without needing as much boost, and it can max that airflow out sooner in the RPM range. You broaden that airflow, you are limited, but you just take advantage of it down the track as long as you can. Which is different than like a naturally aspirated car where you increase the VE. You have no limit to the power as long as you can rev it up and get the VE. But with the turbo car, you can do all that, but you're just gonna do it at less boost. So I think now as we're gonna try to tie it all together and where I think it gets interesting. So at 6,000 RPM, there's a little bit higher back pressure, yet our manifold, even through that small overlap area, made more power per PSI. Why? How did that affect what's in the intake manifold and how that gets into the cylinder? If you think about it as a system, and you do have lower drive pressure, but if you think about it as a system, they're separated, but at that exhaust stroke, when the piston's coming up and it's pushing that exhaust out, at the very end is where it gets really important. And if you don't get all that exhaust out, it's left in there. So during that intake stroke that follows, you have hot exhaust in there. So on that next intake stroke, you can't fit as much fresh intake air charge to actually burn and use into the cylinder. It's taken up by exhaust gas. Essentially, that's making the engine act like a smaller displacement engine. And a way that I really like to think about it now is that volumetric efficiency, again, in the terms that I explained it before, is essentially like the percentage of a 2-liter, I'm just gonna assume, the engine's acting like at that RPM. So you have either, if it's completely cleared out of exhaust gas, you have I know it's not 2 liters, but I'm just gonna say it is 2 liters of airflow at that RPM. But if you have exhaust gas in there, like 10% more exhaust gas, then you have like a 1.8 liter at that RPM. And that explains what caused that sooner spool up on Nathan's test, where it generated more airflow sooner, just like a larger displacement engine does. Like if you want to get something to spool sooner, the easiest way to do it is increase the displacement. But you can also increase the volumetric efficiency. If you do that by 10%, it's like having it 10% larger, or at least using the 10%, using the engine displacement that's already there just to its full extent. So we went on to the fourth test, which was the Evo 9. It was a large runner, both our manifold, large runner versus small runner on a 62mm divided T4 setup. Again, our manifold, only thing that changed was our manifold had the same routing, pretty much the same lengths, only a runner size change. Kind of as expected, the small runner spooled sooner, made more, what wasn't expected is it made more peak power and more peak torque during the test at every boost level, and also that peak drive pressure was a little bit higher, but it was still within like 1 or 4 PSI, and that was within like the 40 PSI range, so it's not huge. And it changed a little bit more as boost went up. And so to kind of explain that with everything else I was talking about before, as far as volumetric efficiency, you'd think that having a larger runner is, and it does, it's gonna immediately get that exhaust gas out sooner, which is what you wanna do. But what's really important is when you get that exhaust gas out right away with a larger runner, right? But when the piston starts going up, the smaller runner is gonna have a lot more energy at the port that's gonna, once it gets most of that out, it's gonna keep pulling on the chamber itself and continue, especially when the piston's right at the top dead, near top dead center, it's gonna keep pulling and pull as much of that exhaust gas out as it can. Whereas with the large runner, it gets it out really quickly, but it doesn't have as much port energy to keep pulling on it, and that really dictates how much exhaust is left in the cylinder for the next intake stroke. That again dictates how much additional fresh air charge you can get in that cylinder.
So Matt, what was the difference in the runner size between the two manifolds when you did it?
Oh
Do you
yeah,
remember?
that's a good thing. So when I say small and large runner is kind of the runner size that like every turbo manifold since like the early 2000s use. It matches like the port area pretty well. So it seems really natural to use a runner size that's like the same area as the port. But on the small runner stuff, you're actually going from that, and it's really important to transition down gently into the smaller runner size, like the stock replacement manifold that's floating around. And it seems kind of awkward to do it, but again, we wanted to test it and make sure. There was some testing with Ron Shearer and Dave Fisher did some testing back in the day as well. It's very setup specific. So they did see that crossover point where once the boost got high enough, I think it was on Bad Bish, on like a 35 HTA 35R or something like that. It did see that crossover point. So the large runner, the small runner couldn't quite get all of that exhaust out in time with the RPM, with the airflow that there was. So it wasn't as good of a match to the setup, which is really important. It's not just about like immediately getting the exhaust out, it's about the rest of the stroke, the rest of what happens up the line. But in our test, it was like a little over 700 wheel horsepower test. The small runner in that case, it made more power everywhere, more torque everywhere, came into boost sooner, more volumetric efficiency, again making it act like a larger displacement engine, which takes less boost to make the same power.
It didn't have a top end restriction.
It didn't, no. And that's a big thing with Kevin Jeweler too, with doing the airflow to make sure that the small runner, it seems like it'd be a restriction. Like it seems so awkward to neck it down. And I don't want to say neck it down because it gives the wrong idea, but you just go smaller in the exhaust port, which is kind of oversized.
I've got Jimmy Reed's car now, and you look at the header that's on that.
That's a small runner too.
Yeah, and you're like, wow. You know,
It's so adorable.
It's so cute. It's like spider legs, you know.
Yeah.
You know, but there's no denying that it does never fall off.
Yeah, it looks scrawny, but like the power curve, like isn't. It's
Power
very-
never falls off.
So it's something I kind of want to point out is like a turbo manifold is often looked like is like a bottleneck to flow. Unless something's really messed up, it definitely can be. But it's not necessarily a bottleneck. It's just how hard you have to keep pushing to get that same airflow. And if you can do it at less boost, that means that you have literally less exhaust gas running around in that intake stroke to contend with. So you have to compress that intake charge even more to fit it next to that exhaust gas, which is there to get that airflow each revolution. Another thing too is you don't have to call upon these fancy wave tuning effects to get more power. All you have to do is just mitigate the effects that are there already that you don't even know about. Like a ton of setups, they have a ton of exhaust gas, residual exhaust gas in there. That blew my mind, to be totally honest. Like how much residual exhaust gas, and then it made so much sense when I realized that that affects the volumetric efficiency of the engine, which
Just
controls,
fix that.
Yeah, just fix that. You don't have, like, you can get away with more fueling wise, you can get away with larger camshafts with more overlap. It kind of protects the engine from the detrimental effects. Instead of relying upon like going above the 100%, you can just get it closer to 100%.
You can go back to your ignition timing because your chamber's a little cooler.
Yeah, so all the back-to-back tests, we didn't touch
Didn't do
anything.
that.
We didn't do that.
Yeah. But that's on the table when you keep the chamber cooler.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have, I mean, it's all about airflow, but you can still obviously get more out of it if the fuel can handle it now. You can get away with less fuel, or less quality fuel, I should say. Kind of opens up that window, the tuning window, really. And I think I'm okay as far as kind of what I wanted to cover. I'm hoping a lot of that made sense. But I am definitely more than willing to clarify. That's kind of our viewpoint on it now. It's more like an airflow side of things. There's things like pumping losses with higher back pressure. The piston has to push the exhaust gas out more, which has a slight effect, but it's really like, it's kind of all about airflow. So that's our viewpoint of it, and then everything else is just details. So definitely want to open up to any questions if anyone has them. I can probably get into. Yes.
So hypothetically speaking, I wanna make some 14B passes again. What's that gonna do for me? The last time out, I was on FPs. I ran a 2G boarded manifold for years, and then I went to the FP manifold when it came out. I wanted the first batch, black gold, whatever. And that's what I used until the compressor not left the compressor wheel and shot the exhaust wheel out. And that was it. That was the last pass I made. I blew the pieces of the shaft and the turbine wheel out of the car. Still went 11.8, by the way. It blew it out at 1,000 feet.
And how?
So
What year was that too?
when did I do that? 2010.
So it makes it way more impressive too. But yeah. So what is that manifold gonna do
Over
for
the
the
well,
14B?
I see you know, I don't do big turbo stuff,
Right.
so some of your testing isn't gonna apply to me. However, if what you're saying about that does apply, it would seem that I would be able to pick up power. But I'm limited by boost, obviously.
You're
I can't
limited by the
spin-
turbo itself. Yeah,
Right.
obviously that 14B compressor, I don't know, 32 pounds per minute, something like that.
Right.
Pushing it to 50% efficiency, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the efficiency's dropping
Yeah.
off. That's a whole nother discussion I could try to get into, but
No, I don't need a big discussion,
No, no,
I'm
no.
just, I'll throw you some cash.
that was me trailing off.
Yeah, sell us something.
Otherwise, the turbo's gonna go on my mantle.
We need something.
That's a really good question.
Sell me manifold.
So you're gonna be limited to that airflow of the 14B. You're
Right.
gonna be able to max that turbo out at a lower PSI. Again, because you don't have that exhaust gas that you contend with.
And then you
Yeah.
don't have the pumping losses.
And you
Yeah, I
don't-
was at 16 PSI, the car did 285 horse, 290 torque. At 21 pounds, it was 295 horse, only 10 peak horsepower, but the torque jumped through the roof up to like 340.
Right.
But keep in mind, that was my stock motor. It was my original motor, balance shafts,
That's awesome.
stock cams, the head had never been off. And so, I planned to, I was stuck at like 11 force. I couldn't go quicker than 11 force, and that was with one 460 foots. I mean, I was getting the thing out of the hole. It was like 719/8 at 94. So it was a great 8-mile car, but it was an Evo front mount. It wasn't really developed. It was just on a chip with the Super AFC2 and 550s.
All making it more impressive as you keep going on.
Well, fair enough.
But yeah.
Thanks. But so if I were to go back at it, I'm gonna go back at it with all the advantages and everyone else. That was still on a 6-centimeter turbine too. I didn't even put my 7-centimeter on it. I never used it. So if I go back, I wanna dump the balance shafts and run 9-to-1 pistons, and I've gotten some HKS cams or whatever else I have kicking around. I have some FP cams that they sent me that I never tested because, well, turbo blew, and that was the end of it. So, kind of more like a max effort thing now, rather than go fast with a little back then with not a whole lot invested. So,
So you're kind of an edge case. You're kind of looking for every last little bit.
Right.
Like on a 14B, if someone contacts us, we're gonna, if they want anything, we'd say, a ported stock manifold or an FP manifold.
right.
But if you're looking for every last bit and you can take advantage. You're limited by that compressor, no matter
Yeah,
what.
right.
That peak power number, you're pretty much gonna be the same no matter what manifold you run.
Right.
But if you make it more efficient, you have less exhaust gas to contend with. You can do it at a lower boost.
Maybe
can
run
fill in those-
16 instead of 21 and create.
They'll have the
Yeah,
same
funny.
power. They'll have the
Yeah.
same power.
And then there's less heat,
And a lot of people, I want to cover this quick. A lot of people want to be able to hold more boost. They change apart and then they can't hold so much boost. Well, you're just getting that same airflow, but you're not requiring as much boost. If you keep trying to push it super hard, you're just gonna have drive pressure go through the roof. Just because you're maxing out the compressor. If you push too hard, it's gonna go slower.
Well,
Or
Sorry to cut
explode.
you off.
Going slower.
I know some of the passes where there was issues for sure, because sometimes I'd run through the 8 at 92.0 and run 116.8 on the top. Other times I'd run 94.8 in the 8th and 113 in the quarter. So there was, I don't know if it was soaking or just the heat, different run, different ambient air temp, whatever.
It gets picky for inlet conditions for sure.
Yeah,
'Cause that
yeah.
changes the
Oh, when
airflow.
you're on the edge of the
That's a
compressor,
trend I
yeah,
noticed,
when
yeah.
you're at the edge of the compressor, having a 20-degree Fahrenheit ambient advantage, huge, man.
Yeah.
Huge.
Right.
Being a 70-degree ambient air day instead of a 90-degree ambient air day, huge on a class. Well, I won't call it a class turbo. Anytime that you're like compressor limited, like whether it's a 62 millimeter class or a 58.8 introducer class or a 72 millimeter class, whenever you're in a class where there's a limit on a turbo, ambient is going to be everything, man. You know, you really, and this is why shaft speed is so important. You're getting into the tall grass here, Phil.
Yeah.
Because you're really gonna need, you need back pressure sensors, you need shaft speed sensors, and you need to really analyze every last little bit of it.
Well, it's
But
your
the bottom
turbos.
line is though,
He built
a manifold
the-
like this with a collector like that is gonna give you an advantage.
Okay. Well, because he built the turbos. I've got two of them. One with a clip, one with no clip. As a matter of fact, if you guys know Shane Webster, who went 1090, I actually let him use, I sent him that turbo with the clip, and that's what he was able to help get him where he was. So I would be using that turbo. You know, just, I've got DSM link now, I've got injectors, I've got camshafts. It's just car and motor.
Yeah.
That's my only DSM sitting up there.
It sounds like you have a lot of things that I'd honestly consider first before a turbo manifold, especially on a 14B.
Yep.
Like I said, you're an edge case, so you're trying to get every last little bit, and you know how to take advantage of those things that you do get, where usually it's really easy, you just get more airflow, you can make more power. But you need to look at those little details to really just get the last little bit out of it.
Right.
And that can do it, but you don't have like that last little bit isn't a lot. So
Right.
like, you have to decide, is the huge price difference worth it?
Well, I don't know the price, but
If
I already have the
you're
F2
chasing those
manifolds.
last few percent around, there are only so many places to buy those percents at.
That's true.
So
that's right.
Tap out everything else.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I never ran E85 either, and apparently that's the way to roll. So,
Give it a shot.
you know, that was on C16 VP, lead.
We definitely, I'd love to chat with you more about it
Sure.
and kind of delve into it. Dave,
Thanks.
do you mind if I cover one more thing I thought? Okay. So, I wanted to talk about some of the things that like really messed us up. Like, there's certain cases where, and I think it's where the most interesting is. It's, I'm trying to think of the word I want to use. Counterintuitive. So, for example, if you go with a larger turbine wheel, it has more inertia, it takes more exhaust flow to spool it up, you're going to expect it to spool slower. And there's certain cases that I wouldn't have believed if it wasn't Kevin Kwiatkowski telling me it, that it actually, a larger turbine wheel spooled sooner, which just sounds backwards. Looking at it from an airflow perspective and a volumetric efficiency perspective, and that volumetric efficiency affects what the engine acts like displacement-wise, it makes a lot more sense. So that larger air, or the larger turbine, plus it was like really efficient, so that helped a ton too. It has way less back pressure, which affects the engine volumetric efficiency, which affects how much actual air charge makes it into the cylinder, and it essentially acts like a larger engine. With just that turbine change, the engine acts larger and helps it spool up sooner. So there you can explain those like counterintuitive cases that honestly, like as of a year ago or so, made no sense at all. Yeah.
Why?
Exactly. So it's not like it's probably not a perfect outlook, and it's always changing. But it just, everything else seems to fall into place the more you can dig into it. And you can really zoom in on just the turbo, you can zoom in on just the manifold, just the engine, etc. And make sense of it, but things change when they're all together. Everything affects everything else up the line and down the line. Everyone looks at the intake conditions, which is totally the right way to look at it, because it just, density and all that stuff is so important, but the exhaust also affects how much you can get into the cylinder.
Doesn't just have to get in, it has to get out.
Exactly. Went this whole time without saying that simple thing that you just said right now.
All right. Right. So that's
So-
gonna wrap up your time. You're good?
Yeah.
I'm good, keep going.
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
I'm just gonna
questions?
bullshit.
Oh, okay.
I had something to interject.
No, I want you to.
No.
Do we have any questions for Matt?
And by all means, if you think of anything, we'll be at the booth. I'll be honest, we're going to be watching some racing when it happens, so we might be in and out, but
I got a question.
yeah.
This relates to just purchasing products. What is your purchase process like? I call you, I talk to you, I tell you about my project. You help me figure out exactly the type of header I need. I pay a deposit. I wait a little while, and you send me a header.
A little while? We're at a lot of while right
Okay,
now.
this is what I'm getting.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't feel embarrassed. We're months out on some part
Yeah.
of the turbochargers too. I mean, that's the way it is right now.
We're really grateful. Like, so to be upfront, we're 20 weeks out. which I know is a super long time, especially early in the year it sucked because like that's the whole season. Now we're kind of getting into winter for certain states and whatever. We don't have a buy it now on the website because a lot of the stuff is built to order. Well, built to order and just a little bit different. Like every setup's a little bit different, and we really like to accommodate for that so you can get the most out of it. Even if it's like not our product, like we'll steer you to the FE race manifold whenever it definitely applies, or even the stock manifold or whatever.
So let me just so let me say
back
this.
on
Does
track.
this sound right then? So I contact you and I go ahead and put my order in. 20-week lead time.
Yeah.
I got 20 weeks to talk to you about it and evolve my project and change my mind 14 times before you actually cut anything. So I get to talk to you for 20 weeks about this project. And so as I have mission creep and I go from selling my 750 injectors and I got some 950s, and by the time we get to around I got 1300s and 2 bigger camshafts, like, but that's okay because I'm in the line.
Yeah,
okay.
we do them in
And
order.
yeah, and so if my project changed in 20 weeks, that's not really a problem on your end, is it? Because that's what you guys are focusing on, is the support end of it and the human. Like, yes, I want to make sure you have exactly what you need.
Yeah.
Part of it. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have like a store.
You guys
We
really.
purchased a Morrison manifold and, I mean, call them up, no problem
Yeah.
getting a hold, Matt's
See, that's hard to get.
responsive. I mean,
That's hard
it
to
was
get.
awesome.
We even sent part of our setup. So
Yeah.
they could mock it up and do everything.
It's a
If
really
anybody
cool-
wants to see the Talon, it's
Yeah.
parked between Force Performance and Morrison. If you
Really
want
nice
to see it.
setup now. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
We don't do a buy it now. Like you send in a contact form, and then we set up a time to call you and talk about your goals and your setup and where you want to go with it, and then we help you decide which one is going to be best for you. And everything is made specifically for you, for your setup.
I like that.
Like it's completely for you.
I like that.
And I mean, leaping off that real quick, like we found really quickly that all these different turbine housings and everything, all the brands, they're different. The center lines from the flange to whatever, so it affects how far the downpipe moves this way, how high it is, how low it is. We have just this huge pile of turbine housings that we just amassed. FP's been nice enough to send us their drunk doorstop ones, where we can build it around your exact turbo setup. You know that everything's gonna clear.
And if we don't have it, we ask you to send it to us too, so that we can mock it
Go
up to
out
make
there.
sure that it's going to just bolt up when you get
That
it.
was my situation. So I sent them all my stuff. I got it all back in. Sure as shit, man. You just put up and it just bolted right in.
Click,
Perfect.
they're good.
Like perfect.
Doesn't happen often enough.
Yeah.
Big sign though.
So I was like, there's no way this is gonna click. Just fit just perfect. I'm like,
Wow.
so I just called my dude. I don't know what voodoo you have, but I like it.
All right, I really appreciate the opportunity. This is really cool to just speak in front of everybody at the shootout, like last in front of Robert and Dave Busher and everyone else here that supports us. It's an honor. So we really can't thank you guys enough for allowing us to be able to do this as a living. It's insane. So thank you.
Ready?